So, welcome again to our daily media briefing about the flood situation in New Brunswick. So, today we're going to have Greg McClellan from EMO, then we're going to have Dr. Nakushi Lemti from Public Health, and we're going to have Ahmed Dasuki from DTI, and we have also some spokesperson from the Department of Environment, Jasmine, Wayne from the City of Fredericton, Ali from the Red Cross, Mark Bellivo from ND Power, and Bruce McFarland. Everybody knows you. And we might get somebody from DNR. They are on their way to meet with us today, so they might be late, but we're going to start with Greg. Greg, if you want to start, s'il vous plaît, commencez.
Merci. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for being here for this May 9th, Wednesday's update on operations. So thank you for being here. The level of the St. John River between Fredericton and St. John has fallen for the second consecutive day. There is a perceptible change, and we can see within the city limits here some streets opening up and trafficability improving, but only a few communities will be below flood stage today, and that's encouraging. But the river's above flood stage in a number of communities yet, and the ongoing threat shouldn't be underestimated or ignored. So we continue to ask New Brunswickers to show the same patience and the same consideration that they've demonstrated since this flood began. Different communities are at different stages in terms of the response. They've all shown resilience and strength in dealing with this unprecedented flooding. And while things may not be moving as fast as they'd like, the job will get done. People can be assured of that. We know that evacuees are tired and frustrated, and they want to return to their normal routine. And everyone's working very hard to enable that to happen. However, rushing back home has the potential to make a bad situation worse in some cases. The current in the river is still strong. The water is cold, and there is a considerable amount of debris in the river, of course. There is flood water that would be considered contaminated because, as I've mentioned in previous meetings like this, we've had a lot of sewage enter the river, a lot of farm refuse, and, of course, just regular debris. So these pose serious health risks, and we do have a doctor here to answer any questions you may have on those. Lots of provincial and municipal roads have been covered with water for over a week in some cases. And while some of them may be dry and they may look just fine, it doesn't mean they're safe to travel on yet. Municipal and provincial officials have to inspect these roads and the culverts and the bridges and those things that will be discovered underneath the water as it recedes. And if only then determining if remedial work is necessary and can be completed to make them safe for motorists. So again, with that in mind, those barricades that we've all become familiar with throughout the impacted area, people need to continue to obey them regardless of what the road might look like. I want to take this opportunity also during this emergency preparedness week to remind people that we're going to be doing the Alert Ready test this evening at 6:55 p.m. And this system, as you've been briefed on before, is a critical capability to issue potentially life-saving alerts to Canadians. It's tested periodically. However, this is the first opportunity for the province to test the system with regard to its wireless ability for, obviously, wireless devices. So this test will take place on television, on radio stations, and on wireless devices that people carry about. There's an audible alarm that comes with this, and there will be a text message on wireless devices or on the screens or on the radio audibly that will be presented for people, and it'll clearly indicate that it's a test. These are routine, and they are necessary to make sure the system is working just fine. But the test is coordinated nationally. You probably heard this morning that with the exception of Ontario and Quebec, which have already tested their system, it'll be tested virtually across the country by all other provinces during the course of the day today. We picked the evening time because that is when we assume, I think correctly, that most people will not be on the drive home, but they'll either be home or at their destination early evening, and that would minimize the number of people tempted to check their text while they're driving on their home trip. A couple of comments about where we are operationally, I think, are appropriate. As I said, response is still very much the theme of operations. And by response, I mean we remain at the same operational posture where we are providing boat operations where necessary to assist in evacuations. As you can appreciate, some people, even at this point, may have gotten to the point where now they do want to leave their homes and be brought to a more convenient, if you like, and comfortable environment. We're also providing presence operations on the water and, of course, a lot of security around barricades and the like. That posture won't change until circumstances permit it to. The next phase of an emergency or a disastrous situation is the recovery phase. And you'll hear a great deal more about that when we turn that corner and start that in earnest. Now, the initial steps of recovery involve inspections prior to anything else, inspections to ensure the safety and the ability to undertake cleanup operations. And at the same time, it involves a determination of exactly what repairs need to be made in so many locations that have been impacted. So it's a slow and deliberate process. It won't be one moment slower than it has to be, but we want people to be patient and understanding so that they can return to a safe environment. They'll be driving on proven, reliable road networks and bridges, and all that takes some time, but rest assured every resource necessary is being devoted to getting that piece done, getting those roads open, and enabling people to get on with their lives, get on with the repairs, and get on with a return to normalcy. So without further ado, I'll now defer to the next speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Lemty, please. Dr. Nakushi Lemty is the Regional Medical Officer of Health. So, thank you.
Thank you, Director. Good afternoon, bon après-midi. My name is Dr. Nakushi Lemty, Regional Medical Officer of Health. I'm here this afternoon on behalf of the Office of the Chief Medical Officer of Health to remind affected residents to take the precautions necessary to reduce possible risk to their health and that of their family. There are a few things we ask people to keep in mind as we continue to respond to this situation. Cooking and eating utensils should be cleaned of all deposits and sanitized. Utensils used for infant feeding should be disinfected according to the manufacturer's recommendations. Wild edible plants, including fiddleheads, which have been exposed to floodwater, may not be safe to eat. Due to the extent of flooding into private and commercial properties, we do not recommend harvesting or buying wild edible plants which would have been budding or had their edible portions exposed to the floodwater. Floodwaters may have contained untreated sewage, fuel, or other contaminants. Plants, including fiddleheads, growing in impacted areas could have been exposed. Boiling of impacted plants would only be effective against microbial contamination, but not chemical. Any plants with their edible portions in contact with floodwaters should also not be consumed or otherwise processed for consumption at a later date. Due to the extensive flooding, it is possible that both microbial and chemical contaminations, such as petroleum, may have occurred. The literature regarding planting suggests a waiting period of 30 to 90 days after floodwater is no longer present, and this waiting period can vary based on the extent of the contamination. Foods intended for raw consumption, especially leafy greens and root vegetables, are especially at risk if the recommended waiting period is not followed. Tillage, sunlight, air, and soil over time will contribute to the breakdown of most contaminants. Soil microbial activity over time will contribute to the breakdown of most contaminants. It's also recommended that well water should be tested prior to using for watering gardens. We also suggest for smaller scale gardens that you can use a raised bed with fresh soil. Finding the extent of contamination may be difficult. We are in the process of trying to gather further information in order to provide some guidance. Public Health, in consultation with the Department of Agriculture, Aquaculture, and Fisheries, will conduct a further review and assessment on the potential impact to exposed commercial croplands during the recovery period. Last, I would like to remind residents that we continue to work closely with New Brunswick Emergency Measures organization, and we will continue to share important information through them. Thank you.
I would like to welcome Ahmed Dessouki, from the Director of Operations at Transportation and Infrastructure.
Thank you, Vicky. Thank you. Now that the waters have begun to recede, DTI has begun to transition into the recovery process. Our recovery effort is focused on the restoration of transportation links in a safe and timely manner. Our top priority will be the links in isolated communities. DTI crews are out in the field inspecting roads and bridges where waters have receded enough to do so. On that note, I can confirm to you that the bridge on Route 10 in the village of Chipman will be reopened to traffic this afternoon, if it hasn't done so already. There will be a 12-ton restriction on the bridge until further notice. As you look at other links that can be restored, we are moving resources from other districts within the province that are less impacted to help assist in those areas that have been harder hit. We want to remind motorists and pedestrians that crossing bridges that have been closed due to high water can be dangerous. These bridges have been closed for public safety and to maintain the integrity of the structure. The same goes for roads. If there's a barricade in place, the road is still closed. Even if the water has receded, we need to inspect these roads to ensure that they are safe for traffic. We currently have 152 roads affected in the province, including 76 closed or partially closed, and we are currently monitoring 73 other roads. That number continues to fluctuate, so MB511.ca remains your best source of information on roads or lane closures. The Trans-Canada Highway remains closed through traffic from exit 306 in Oromocto to exit 423 in Riverglade. The detour route remains in place. We are still anticipating that MRDC will be able to reopen the highway to one lane in each direction by the weekend. We will continue to communicate road closures and detours to the public, and we appreciate the media's help in doing so. We ask people to check MB511.ca for the latest up-to-date road closures. We thank the public for their continued patience and cooperation as we respond to this unprecedented flooding. Thank you.
Merci, Ahmed. Thank you. I believe Wayne Cano from the City of Fredericton has a few words for us.
Thank you, Director. Just to inform the public that most or all of the on-ramps and off-ramps to the Westmoreland Street Bridge are now open. Most of the streets in the City of Fredericton are also open. They have been cleaned and inspected. We only have less than probably about 10 streets that are still closed. We are now in the process of transitioning into the recovery stage. And just to inform you that our recovery team is meeting this afternoon to put together the strategy and the plan on a go-forward basis, and I'll have more details and information for you tomorrow. Thank you.
Merci, Wayne. Thank you, Wayne. So now we're going to open the floor for questions. So let us know who you would like to talk to. And we have Dwayne Sabine from DNR who just joined us. So yes, the floor is open. Vos questions, s'il vous plaît. Yes,
question for DTI. Yes, sir. I'm kind of curious how the cleanup efforts on the highway are going.
So, as I said, we have about 74 roads that we're monitoring, or some of them the water has receded. So DTI crews in the regions are looking at some of those efforts into removing the debris, collecting it, and through communication with the Department of Environment and other agencies to let us know how to deal with some of that debris and how to dispose of it. So that's sort of how we're doing it. So as the water recedes in some of those roads, our crews Our crews are out there trying to see if they can move some of that debris to get the roads open as fast as we could.
How much stuff is out there?
I don't know, to be honest, how much stuff is out there. Give you another example. Some of the areas, the water might be off the road, but still the water's on the shoulder level. So we really need to wait for the water to recede even a little bit further to see how much real debris or any damage to the shoulders out there. So I'm not sure how much they're out there. I can't quantify that. Thank you.
Yes.
Question, questions?
Mr. Curriculum, maybe you said that already, but those teams that will be in charge of looking at houses to make sure that it's safe to go back, have they started to do their work in some part of the region, like Fredericton, for example?
Actually, the inspections, health and safety inspection teams is how we refer to them, they began their work, as you would appreciate, as they were able to access properties. And in fact, they started on Monday in the northern parts of the province, areas that were known to be impacted. And they've essentially completed the work in some locations. They're finishing up in other locations because it wasn't as dramatic an amount of work to be done. Grand Falls, Miramichi, areas that had reported impacts required to be inspected, and they were. Now what happens next is those teams, of course, would be redeployed to the south and incorporated into the larger effort for the larger requirements as we progress down the river.
So do you know, for example, if they started in Fredericton?
I can't confirm that. I would suggest if they haven't, they probably will look at getting a start as the streets open up, perhaps as early as this afternoon, and certainly tomorrow. Now, there are specific locations that have already been looked at as water receded over the last couple of days, specifically the Justice Building, where some cleanups required, and a few other locations right here in the city. But it's just really beginning, as you can see, a discernible difference in water levels.
I'm confused how that works. So do the property owners call to ask for help and safety inspection team, or are they going and do they have a decision on whether someone moves back in or not? How does that work?
Okay, thanks for the question. In fact, you recall we have mentioned on a number of occasions we want people to report damages, and there's some places where it's obvious that it's happened. This health and safety inspection team is composed of, it is a team of people from public health, people from structural engineering, people from environment, and people from fire and electrical. So these folks go to a property, and each of them in their area of expertise assess the extent of the damage, and more specifically provide a professional opinion on the habitability and the ability when it's able to be re-entered, to start cleanup, or in some cases simply to reoccupy.
And is it the property owner has to call them, or do they go?
If they've registered, they will be dispatched to those registered properties. And of course, there's cases where perhaps somebody hasn't registered, but they will go to the property, assuming that they're at the point where the owner is back there, and they'll speak to the owner, or the owner will be informed that this inspection service is available to them.
Just to finish that thread, though, so do they have the power to tell homeowners if it's unsafe and they shouldn't be living there to block them from living?
These are technical inspection services in some cases, and they do not make a final determination and tell the homeowner anything except those absolutely immediate safety requirements, like it has to be de-energized or it has to remain de-energized. Right now, public health is saying that there is enough of a contaminant problem or a mold problem, but it's an advisory thing, and at the same time, it gives us a sense of what the work scope would be.
We've talked about disaster tourism many times before now. I talked to a woman in Hamilton today who was saying how people were voting between her house and the neighbor, how it was hard to sleep because there were people in the street constantly doing basically looking around. And she said that the city of Hamilton ended up sending flyers to people just to warn them once more not to do that. Do you know if that happened a lot? other cities that do that if people complain a lot about that being a disaster tourism?
Well, I haven't personally, it hasn't come to my attention that there's been a lot of people complaining about it, but there has been some isolated cases where people have indicated their dissatisfaction. I mean, we have one story about people throwing nails on the road and that sort of thing, trying to impede vehicles going down it. But we're not getting a flood, no pun intended, folks. We're not getting a flood of complaints about boating activity. A lot of the boating activity in Maysville in particular is between neighbors helping neighbors. And, you know, like I've mentioned many times, you know, we provide a presence so that there is certainly visible security and eyes on communities, but it's not intended to be, and I'm quite confident that it's not, you know, really an irritant to people. It should be a reassurance.
Now with the water going down in Fredericton, is there any concern about city parks, particularly I'm thinking Carlton Park, where the water's gone down, but there's a lot of debris. Is there any concern about contamination of that area or any messaging to people you like to get out if they're going to that park?
I'd offer a comment, and then I'd invite the city representative, Mr. Talon, to also comment. I don't want this contamination description of the river to be overstated. You know, there's a difference between an oil sheen on the water or some, you know, a fuel spill or whatever. But remember, this is not a completely filthy river here. There's debris, there's cleanup. A lot of this nature, in fact, will assist in the cleanup of. But, you know, rest assured that there will be testing. There will be a determination of safety for all public spaces, not simply roads or bridges. So, you know, again, appealing to people's patience. But, you know, unless a place has been really inundated for a long period of time, I'm quite confident in saying that, you know, once the water recedes and folks have had a chance to go out and improve the ground, we'll get back to normal in parks and otherwise. Wayne, did you want to offer some comment?
Just to say that those assessments are being done as we speak, and that'll be part of the debrief this afternoon at 3 o'clock when we meet with the recovery team.
Question for Department of Health.
Yes,
You mentioned earlier that fiddleheads are kind of off grounds. Does that mean for the entire season, should New Brunswickers not be consuming this cultural, I guess, treat?
Well, thanks for raising that issue. I think one thing I would clarify is the concern about fiddleheads that would have been growing in impacted areas. So this is a large province, not the entire province was impacted. So our statement is wild edible plants, including fiddleheads, which have been exposed to floodwater, may not be safe to eat. So if individuals are harvesting it for themselves, they would have a sense of whether it's an area that's been impacted or not.
So is that just flooded areas in general, or north of the dam, or what are we looking at here?
Well, I think the statement is sort of permissive of the fact that we, standing here, won't necessarily be able to determine that. So really, I think people should look to the wording, which is fiddleheads which may have been exposed to floodwater may not be safe to eat. We don't have a mechanism to be able to determine that in every area where fiddleheads grow in the wild. So we ask people to use their best judgment that if it's an area where there's been flooding, the safer option is not to consume it if it was flooded.
But you would also mention whether it was already budding, right?
Right.
Because I guess the concern, I've talked to some fiddlehead pickers, and I mean, this plant, it grows in the freshet. It comes from floodwaters. That's where they're picked.
Right.
Every year.
Mm-hmm.
And the concern I heard was that public health seems to say this every year, not just this year, and that they seem to think the product's safe. So is it correct to say that it's more concerned if there was an area where there were chemicals, or if the thing was actually budding, right, at the time of the flood?
So there's two components that you're mentioning, and I think both are important in understanding the message. So yes, it's edible portions that have come into contact with floodwaters should not be consumed, because the ability of any contaminant to get in would be partially related to that contact. And then the second part of your question, sorry if you can just remind me.
Well, I guess, you know, is it more a concern? See, the farmer I talked to said, you know what, it's, you know, it's fertilizer. I mean, that's what manure is. He said if you know how to take care of fiddleheads and they're washed properly and you boil them before consuming, the sewage shouldn't be an issue. But I would think the chemicals would be, because you can't boil that out.
Absolutely, you're raising a good point. So certainly there's a component of flooding that's natural, right? And plants growing is also part of that natural process. What's a little bit different is when the flooding is so extensive that we have some interaction with human activity, including you know, use of things that wouldn't normally be in the environment. So it's the chemical concern, you're right, that we can't assess at this point. And so the safer option is if there's an area that's been flooded and there are fiddleheads that are budding that could have come into contact with that water, we can't assess whether there's microbial or chemical contamination. So the safer option is just to not consume the budding fiddleheads from that area.
Okay, the other thing you had mentioned, you said there was a 30 to 90 day, I don't know, contamination window when I guess fields have been flooded. Did I get that right?
I was specifically speaking about people's gardens in that respect, because people grow a range of, you know, wild plants or leafy vegetables, right. And it really depends on the plant and the amount of flooding and a whole bunch of factors. So that's why there's a range of 30 to 90 days.
Because, I mean, when you mentioned all those plants and you said 90 days, I mean, our growing season here is so short, it would basically say you can't eat those vegetables this.
Well, for people's private gardens, the other option is to bring in fresh soil on a raised bed so that they can plant their garden.
What about farmers along Majorville, like that have been flooded? Is there going to be any restriction on them planting crops this year and for people buying those things?
So that's a good question. I think it's too early to say. So I'll just refer to the last part of my statement, which included the information that we will be consulting with the Department of Agriculture, Aquaculture, and Fisheries to conduct a review and assessment of the potential impact to exposed commercial croplands. So you were speaking about an intervention, and you don't intervene until you've done an assessment, and that assessment will come in the coming period during recovery.
I have a question for the Department of Energy, Mines, and Natural Resources.
Dwayne?
Yes.
How you doing, Dwayne?
Good.
How are GEMSEG moves going?
Well, our staff at Energy and Resource Development have been monitoring several moves for the past week or so in the GEMSEG area. And there's an obvious public safety concern there with a large animal that on highways. The highways have been closed for the past week, and that bought us some time. We've been monitoring them and watching where they go. The only high water available to those animals to move to is the roadbed of the 4-lane Trans-Canada. So sometime last week, our staff managed to move one moose, which was at the GEMSEG, the west end of the GEMSEG Bridge, across the bridge to high ground on the east side. They've been monitoring 2 other moose on the northern end of the St. John River Bridge in Sheffield, and with the thought of attempting the same thing, they attempted that yesterday to move them across, and in the end, they turned out to be too weak. They could really only walk a few steps. One of them was badly injured, and our staff made the decision to euthanize those 2 animals after examining the situation and the conditions, condition of the animals. It was deemed to be the best option in that case, given that the highway will soon open and the animals were too weak to probably make it any longer.
What time was that done?
It was done about 3 p.m. Yesterday.
We got a lot of feedback from readers asking why more wasn't done to relocate them, or even just to feed them to give their strength back.
Well, feeding them is not doesn't work all that well. Moose and deer, they're in their worst condition this time of year. They subsist on a diet of woody twigs. Their body weight diminishes through the winter. They're still living on that diet until the green vegetation comes out. It's not really a matter of these moose starving to death. It's more they've been submerged in cold water for some time. Until the highway closed, they were out in the water. They can't get warm and dry. It's energetically it's very hard on them. Dealing with public safety issues with large animals, moose, deer, and bear, is something that ERD staff deal with on an ongoing basis throughout the year, particularly in and around highways. And there are a number of options we can do. The primary, or the first option we always look to, is to move the animals to a safe area. And it's successful the vast majority of the time. The other two options are it's chemical immobilization using what's commonly referred to as a drug dart. It's not as simple as the television would make most people think. It can represent a danger to staff. It can represent a danger to the public if darts disappear. In this case, because animals quite often run when they're darted, they're going to run into the water. They're on a very narrow strip of highway. And the bigger consideration is they were so weak, they couldn't really handle the stress of being drugged. It wasn't seen as a viable option, and it is something that they would have looked at carefully.
Was there any attempt made to feed them?
Not that I'm aware of, but again, they eat this time of year woody twigs. There is lots of food in the vicinity, right next to the highway. Obviously, when they're up laying on the highway, it's not available to them, but those moose have been moving in and out of the water, sometimes to feed over the past week.
Is it just the 3 moose you mentioned, the 2 that were euthanized, and the 1 that was successful?
No, when we first started monitoring last week, a week ago today, actually, there were 8 moose underneath on Route 105, the old Trans-Canada, underneath the bridge over the St. John River, the north end of Sheffield. Those moose, during the day, all moved to the westward, where there is an isolated piece of high ground. We're not sure if they made it to that piece of high ground or not, but 8 is the highest number we are aware of, and then during the week 2 more showed up after those 8 disappeared, and our staff had been monitoring them since then. And they will, it's quite possible for other moose to move into that area now. They are wandering around the area, and our moose will continue to, our staff will continue to monitor that area as the floodwaters recede and as the highway opens, because it will be some time before there is dry ground in the Grand Lake Meadows that these animals can access.
So I just want to make sure I got the numbers right. You observed 8 moose, 2 more, so that's 10. 1 was successfully moved, 2 were euthanized.
We observed 8 moose a week ago today, and then over the past week, 2 at the north end of the St. John River Bridge and 1 at the western end of the Gemseg Bridge. And there are a number of other moose in the Majorville and Sheffield area that we're also aware of.
Dernière question, last question.
Were these adult moose, by the way?
Yes.
I guess, would you say everything was done that was possible to save?
Yeah, I would say our staff assess the situation. They deal with these things, as I say, on an ongoing basis, and they would have looked at all the available options. And it's not a decision they take lightly to euthanize an animal. Our staff do not enjoy doing it. It was a last resort.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup. I'll see you tomorrow. Same place, same time.